So welcome everybody to this special SciDev-Net debate where we'll discuss how to report on water conflicts and cooperation. My name is Fiona Broom, although my Zoom name says SciDev Webinars. I'm the Deputy Editor for Features at SciDev-Net, which is the world's leading source of reliable and authoritative news, views, and analysis about science and technology for global development. Today's debate is supported by the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education and the DUPC2 project. And the team at IHE Delft recently released a new expert guide called Water Conflicts and Cooperation, a Media Handbook, which is available as an open access book. And my colleague and co-host Davis, he will drop a link into the chat box so you can find that book. Just quickly, a few little practical matters before we begin. We're really keen to hear everybody's questions. If you do have a question, you can see at the bottom of your screen that there's a little Q&A box. I know Zoom appears a bit differently on different devices, but you should have a Q&A box there. Please use that to ask questions. There's a chat box also where you can share comments and links and that sort of thing. But if you have a question for the panelists, you'll need to pop that in the Q&A section. And Davis and I will keep an eye on that box. You should also, up in your top right hand corner, you should have a little view button so you can choose how you'd like to see the speakers. And if you're posting on social media, you can use the hashtags SciDev-Net debate and also hashtag water conflicts. So why are we discussing how to report on water conflicts and cooperation? News reports can influence negotiations over shared water resources, and they can play a key role in determining if the outcome of negotiations is conflict or if it's cooperation. And water is a complex topic. It touches every part of our lives every single day, and it bridges a range of issues such as science and politics, culture, gender, as well as economics, the environment, and climate change. And it follows then that reporting on water is complex, as journalists need to build an understanding of all of these issues, along with another concept that we'll be discussing, water diplomacy. So how can we communicate in the sensitive context of international rivers? In particular, today we'll be looking at the Nile and the Brahmaputra rivers. So here today to shed light on these issues, we have Ashok Sain, who is the head of Uppsala University's Department of Peace and Conflict Research. We also have Jane Baitwa. Jane is a communications and stakeholder engagement specialist at the Nile Basin Initiative. And I think Jane's having some camera issues, but she's there. Joydeep Gupta is an environment journalist and director of the Third Pole and India Climate Dialogue. We have Rehab Abd Almohsen. Rehab is a freelance science journalist and editor. And from the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education, we have Emanuele Fantini, who is a lecturer and researcher in water politics and communication, and Jennifer Serving, who's a researcher and lecturer in water governance and diplomacy. Excuse me. So let's get started by beginning with some very brief explanations or definitions of some of the terminology that we'll be using during the conversation. Ashok, can you just start with a quick definition of what do we mean when we talk about conflicts and cooperation?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. But conflicts and cooperations are two sides of the same coin, and this is part of life. But we have unlike in any water conflict or water cooperations, you will find both conflict and cooperation coexisting. But we have a tendency in particularly in research or reporting or in any way we are describing any water interaction, we have a tendency to overhype whether it's in an open conflict or even an open cooperation. The reason is because when there is a certain kind of disagreement comes in, we try to describe it as a water conflict or even a water war. I mean, I think we need to be very careful of any kind of conflict which is there. There is certain areas of cooperation still coexisting. There are certain rivers, there are many rivers where you might find that they are probably quite a lot of discussions, quite a lot of disagreement. We even describe it as very much a water conflict in operation, but they have signed several agreements. But another thing is that when we do try to overhype a conflict or any kind of open disagreement over water, we also overhype any kind of agreement over the water, and we call it peace. I mean, so there is a water peace, but we need to really be careful to understand that I could give you an example, like in Indus River, which has signed an agreement since 1960s, but it's probably this one of the river system which has seen most of the conflicts and many times all this kind of threat of war, threat of violence goes on. In Brahmaputra, that's no agreement has been signed, but it's less conflictual has been till now compared to Indus. So I think this is somehow we need to really look at what exactly you're saying and how we really getting into this, because agreements, if you remember in the early 90s, when I particularly started doing research on the water conflicts, water wars, and then suddenly we said, oh, after the Cold War period is over, there are many water conflicts or water war going to take place. Then we saw that, or at least some of the research found out, the countries have signed more agreements, and we suddenly moved from the water war to water peace literature. But these were agreements which were signed, we didn't really look at them very carefully because agreements usually favor the hydrohegemons, the powers in that area, or traditionally it has been. Agreements also ask for more exploitation of water resources. You can see that whenever many of these agreements actually lead to dam building or the water diversion. So we must realize that these agreements are not always good. We should also look at so the important thing is we must look at the quality of agreement before jumping into conclusion that whether we have really reached cooperation or peace. So I think it is what I'm saying, that it is a conflict and cooperation always coexist. Sometimes some places conflicts become a bit more open and cooperation looks at in more agreement wise. But I think we need to be very careful while opening or while explaining or while describing a particular type of interactions which is going on shared water resources.
Thanks, Ashok. And Jennifer, could you give us a quick understanding of water diplomacy?
Yes, thank you, Fiona. Indeed, so as Ashok mentioned, so over the last decades, we have seen increased research on water conflict and cooperation. And I think one thing that it showed was that decisions about use, management, protection of transboundary water resources are often very much embedded in a complex setting of political factors that sometimes have nothing to do with the water sector as such, and therefore bringing in diplomats and foreign policy might actually help water experts, engineers to solve these water problems. So when at IHE, when we talk about water diplomacy, we refer to all the political processes and tools that of agreeing on joint water governance arrangement and of peacefully solving and addressing water-related disputes. And these tools and practices can be quite different, though they range from negotiations, from informal dialogues to also more technical issues like joint fact-finding or trust building efforts like joint conferences, summer schools. And I think therefore it's very important to stress that when we say water diplomacy, it doesn't mean that it's only about diplomats of foreign ministries meeting in high-level, government negotiations or activities of other government officials. This is one track of what we also often is called multi-track diplomacy, but also activities of NGOs, of academics, of joint research projects. So also these are part of these other tracks of water diplomacy, and also people-to-people dialogue, like really with, for example, youth camps or issues like this. And in this respect, also now when we talk about media and journalists, so actually they are not only there to report about water diplomacy, but they also can be seen as actors of water diplomacy. And in the handbook, there were some examples of these joint journalist projects. So I think they are nice examples of how this broad understanding of water diplomacy can also be used as a has opportunities to address water conflicts in a constructive manner and beyond these purely governmental track.
Thank you. So we're talking about two regions in particular today, the Nile and the Brahmaputra regions. Let's begin with the Nile region. Rehab and Jane, what are the most challenging aspects of water reporting and water communications in the Nile region? Rehab, let's begin with you.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. Well, I will start with what Dr. Jennifer said. One of the challenges is not looking at the media as one of the players on this whole topic of water. So I think that we need to address media as one of the many players in this sector. We have researchers, different type of researchers. We have geographers and geologists, politicians. All are playing parts in this topic. But we never address media as one of those players. Though I believe that the role of media proven to be very critical in this topic. Not only to send the message or deliver the message to the audience, but even to bridge the gap between researchers themselves. I witnessed how political experts or they look at the topic of water in a total different way than engineers, for instance. So filling this gap need a better or a bigger role for media. The other challenge that I find it very critical is how this topic, the whole water issue, is very politicized. So this leads to many other challenges, like how, as I said before, we have a lot of experts playing role in this topic, but yet none of them want to talk about this to the media, because it is kind of dangerous sometimes. It is related to national security issues. So this is one of the things, and it leads to another challenge, which is scarcity of data, reaching a simple number of the amount of water consumed by this country or that for agriculture sector. Might be a big challenge for a journalist, and sometimes numbers are not solid. Like you get different numbers from different sources. So those parts are parts of the challenges that we journalists are facing. Yes, it is one of the other challenges is covering water. Needs a lot of preparation and a lot of reading in this topic to make it more interesting to reader. You need to link water to other topics, otherwise it becomes very boring. And this is how we fail into the trap of linking water to war, because we as a journalist, we want to make it more exciting. So I think we need to do a better job reading and preparing for covering water.
Thank you. And Jane, for you, what are the most challenging aspects in terms of communicating issues around water sharing in the Nile region?
Thanks a lot, Fiona. I'll put my video very briefly because it's not very good. And sorry, I have a different banner at the back for an activity that just ended. But yeah, I'm happy that I know some few people here, like Rehab, like Emmanuel. So glad to see you guys after a very long time. So talking about the challenges, first of all, I would like to say that actually the NBI considers the media as one of the key stakeholders as far as the multi-track water diplomacy is concerned. And so it's for this very reason that we engage the media. We have a whole program to engage the media because we realize that they are a very important stakeholder when it comes to water diplomacy. So talking about the challenges that I see in communicating is that as a communication person, there are a number of terminologies. It's quite so technical to talk about water. And so you really need to take time to understand so as to be able to put out this message for the public to say, to also appreciate and understand. However, I have worked for the Nile Basin Initiative, but before I have worked for the Ministry of Water in Uganda. You find that the technical people there many a times do not really appreciate the role of communication, the importance of communication. I will give an example. When I worked for the Ministry of Water in the Directorate of Water Resources, they told me, but what's the purpose of communication? If I construct a dam, people can see that there is a dam here. Why should I go talking about the dam? So for them, it's like, it's not so important to talk about anything. As long as they do the job and it's done and people can see, then that's it. So to bring them on board, the technical people, to appreciate, to understand that communication has a role to play as far as water or whatever they are working on water related is concerned, has been a challenge for me. So that is besides for me understanding the issues, the technical language, but also for them to appreciate that communication has a role to play. So you find that someone is maybe coming up with a project, a new project, but everything that they talk about, nothing about communication. How is communication going to be done around this project or around this activity that we are working on? So I find this really a very big challenge. And it is something, for example, for us here at the Secretariat in NBI, we have agreed to have a program team meeting. What we even started by calling it piloting cooperation within, looking at how communication and the program team that is working on in the area of water, how can we cooperate to see that whatever they are doing, the communication team is able to push it out there. So that is the challenge I find, to understand myself, to be able to understand the different terminologies, but also for the technical team to appreciate the importance of communication or the role of communication. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And Joydeep, in terms of the Brahmaputra region, what are some of the challenges of reporting there?
Challenges are just the same as in the Nile or any other transboundary river, which has even a slightly conflictual situation. The basic challenge is the politician. The basic challenge is the narrow worldview of national governments who do not want water to be seen as a sort of common property resource between countries. They basically want to see this as their own resource, as their own property when it comes to a transboundary river or even to a transboundary lake or anything of that sort. So given that this background, it's not a surprise at all that in a very tense part of the world through which the Brahmaputra flows, there is constant conflict. And of course, there are many sections of the media who love to play up that conflict for whatever reason, including that of television rating points or circulation, or the journalist being a bit too close to a particular politician or to a particular government. So that's how all these bogies of water war and water conflict are built up, which is not to say that there are no problems. Of course, there are problems in transboundary rivers. Transboundary rivers, if you go back in history, are probably the one case where the nation states have almost always failed to come to any agreement since the birth of the nation state in the Middle Ages. There are very, very few exceptions. There are one or two exceptions in Europe, I'm aware of. Apart from that, there are very, very few exceptions, whether pre-colonial world, colonial world, or post-colonial world, of governments actually managing to get any transboundary river cooperation going. And that is reflected in the media. There are ways of handling it, but till the media is sensitized, till the media is willing to use those ways of handling it, I'm afraid we're going to go along the same route, whether it's in the Nile or the Brahmaputra.
Mm. Thanks, Joydeep. And Ashok, same question to you.
I agree with Joydeep. What is going on in Brahmaputra? It's not about water. It's more about power. It's a very big power change taking place in that region, in that basin. Used to be Brahmaputra water is quite a plenty of water, very much unused in that term of the sense that it is not being used for irrigation and other things. That is, there is a water scarcity is an issue. But the question is, the water, that river was an issue between India and Bangladesh, but now China has become a major party upstream. And China has been started directly using the water for hydropower generation. And the power difference, because when India-Bangladesh relationship was, India was on the upper hand in power-wise, whereas China has brought in, so it has changed the dynamics of the power structure within the basin. So this is somehow we're looking at the background, how this has changed and this is being perceived. But we also all know that China hasn't signed any water agreement with anyone. And this is also a question which needs to be looked at. I mean, and also the report should be done that in a sense that China, what is the China's history of the China, in spite of not signing the water agreements with the downstream countries, how it cooperates without even signing the agreements we have seen in Mekong and so on. So I think this is somehow the lack of understanding of how the new member into the basin who has come in, how it operates in the water sector. And that's how it has reports has been also misled. And I think what I see, particularly in the India and to some extent in Bangladesh, the reporting has been primarily particularly on this river water issue, by the strategic experts rather than the water experts. And the strategic experts, as Rehab was mentioning before, and the water experts don't want to get into this because it's for them it's too much of national security issue. Why to invite trouble? Then the strategic experts really paint it as Joydeep was mentioning, depending on which side of the political fence they are sitting. And they're not strategic experts. They're rather politically making these kind of calculations, which helps them, their political masters. So this is how I think the real problem lies. I mean, look at it. There was a couple of years ago, I think 3 years back, there was a report. There are certain rivers, when the downstream in Indian side, it started, muddy water came in. And suddenly the Indian media started reporting that the China has started diverting the water from Brahmaputra upstream. I mean, if anyone which has a little bit knowledge of how that river is, where the water, how you can divert from that kind of water where the China really needs the water, you will never make these kind of stupid statements. But the Indian newspapers were filled with this news that China has started diverting this water. So I think these are the kind of things, the reporting, we need water experts to come into this, or the water experts, those who really understands the basin, those who understand how it has been operating, how the other countries do have their own sense of priorities, these kind of things which needs to be reported, rather than looking at these so-called warmonger or water experts in all of these countries, those who are strategic experts, those who are really painting the story, which is not exactly the story.
Thanks, Ashok. So this term water wars has already come up. We know that, it's a favorite term of some reporters and editors and politicians and 1980s filmmakers. Is there any such thing as water wars? Have they occurred in the past? Is there any history of them in modern history? Should we expect them in the future? Manuele, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that we all associate water to life and war to death. So I think there's no doubt that the idea of water wars sounds to many editors or journalists as a scary, but definitely also powerful image to attract the attention of the audience. And I think especially from audiences that might be far away from the rivers that the journalists are reporting on. We did, for instance, a research on narratives about the Nile in the media in Egypt, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, but also on global media like The Guardian and Al Jazeera. And we discovered that the frame of the water war is mostly used by global media to attract the attention of the audience on rivers like the Nile. While local journalists do not use such image, such frame, I think because they are fully aware that they themselves will be the first to be affected. If you securitize water, like the water war frame does, then the space for freedom of expression and also for freedom of research immediately shrink. As was mentioned by Rehab, journalists are not free to critically report on something that is considered an issue of national security. Experts don't want to comment because they're afraid. So my first point is that the water war frame is dangerous, particularly for local journalists and researchers. And my second point is that the water war frame is also inaccurate. And I guess that's also why local journalists don't use it, because it does not reflect what is going on. Water wars have been announced in the past 30 years. And unfortunately, in those 30 years, we have seen many wars, too many wars in the past 30 years. But none of that wars has been caused by water. Of course, in some cases, water has been used as a weapon, maybe as a strategic resource in the conflict. And we see it also today with the war in Tigray in Ethiopia. This is not a water war, but of course, as soon as it started, water, in this case, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the Nile, have been brought in. But water did not dictate the war. I think war is always a political choice, and that's something we should remember. War is a political choice. War is not dictated by water scarcity or climate change. So my plea to journalists and editors is to avoid using the water war frame and instead try to hold accountable those in power for their political choice of making war and for the political choice of using water as a pretext or as a weapon in armed conflict.
Thanks, Manuele.
Thank
Ashok, is water ever a cause of war, or is it more of a casualty of war?
I think I agree with Emmanuel, and that you also answered the question. Water has been, it's a casualty of the war. It has been for a long period of time. Many wars, water has been somehow affected because of the war and violence taking place in different parts of the world. But water being the cause of the war, we haven't seen it. And there is also, we need to look at it a bit carefully. There is never a single reason to cause a war. Wars are always, if you ask me any war which is taking place and give me one reason why it is taking place, like, even in the conflict in Tigray, you ask me one question, that give me one answer that what is the reason for this, then you won't. And this has been always the issue. But I think water war, which if you take a look at it, water causing the war, we haven't seen the evidence yet exactly that how water directly caused the war. But it is true there is a developing norms also that what you ask the question that in the war whether we can really use the water as another, to cause damage to the water facilities or not. And there is a developing international norms now not to target the water facilities, even though we are fighting the war for different times. And I think these discussions came in, particularly in recent times when in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, particularly when the discussion was getting really, and then there was some kind of discussion, there will be some kind of targeting of the Grand Renaissance Dam. I said, no way, this is not going to take place. Don't get in there. And this is the kind of things that we try to, some of this, again, I have a very strong reservation of these so-called strategic experts, particularly those who come into the TV debates and write certain kind of articles sometimes without having a knowledge about the water and making these comments which creating these kind of issues of water. Well, the real journalists, those who really understand the water, they will never say the water war is going to take place. It is some of the very specific community which are more in the strategic level rather than in the water side, which they really jump into that kind of conclusion. And I think I have reasons why water war or water will not be targeted in the war. That if because we have, if you hit a mine dam, I will hit your dam. Means this is, I call it a balance of terror in the water war strategy. Like take for example, India, Pakistan have fought 4 wars, they never target each other's dams. They target everything, but not the dams. Because and it's very easy to target. But why they don't target? Because if you target one's dams, the other you open, and the dams are not you are hiding it in anyone's house that you can hide it. It's open to any kind of target, any kind of attack, military attack. Then if also dams, if you want to build a dam and the other country wants to really target because you get affected and create a water war, dams takes a long time to build. Like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is it has been there for some time. I have seen in the blueprint in the 90s, early 90s, but the dam has been being built now for 9 years, and it is not yet complete. So the downstream countries, in spite of their all kinds of reservations, they are somehow prepared mentally, psychologically, and also somehow infrastructurally that how to address this issue once this issue comes up. And I think this gives time, because a war, if somebody really goes to war, it has to be very sudden change, which doesn't take place in the dam buildings cases. And then also many people, those who have not able to build dams, dig these dams without the international support. And international support, international funding doesn't come unless you have an agreement. It's a very few countries those who have done. Of course, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam 1, the Turkey dams in Turkey, and I think India, China, those who have built the dams, big dams before, they are only internal dams, not an international one. So only 2 countries, those who have built the dams on the upstream and international rivers, there are Turkey and Ethiopia. Not many countries in the global south have done it. So there are very much restrictions of how to you use these kind of things, how the connections between water and war. I'm sorry for giving a very complicated answer, but there is no quick answer to this, whether water war has taken place or water war is a storm. But I think there is also, we need to, I understand it, but in the climate change is bringing certain kind of discussion again back to that water might become a much more seriously, we need to look at it. We can't just say that there hasn't been any water war. Water has not been targeted by the war. But the climate change, by bringing these several uncertainties, we need to re-look at it also to it as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashok. And Joydeep and Rehab, as members of the media, as journalists and editors yourselves, why do you think that this water wars frame remains popular with news outlets? Rehab, would you like to begin?
Well, Okay, what I'm going to say is open to debate, and it's not like a fact. But I was thinking about this link between water and war, and I was thinking, why not? Like, why not? And I know that water war never happened before, but there is a chance that is in the future going to take place. So for media, from a media perspective, why not covering it? But on the other hand, what I can say that I know that water war is one of the many scenarios that might take place. So what I see that media is not covering all the other scenarios. They are only focusing on water war. They are excessively covering water war and linking water to war. Not only media, by the way. Before this webinar, I was Googling water war just out of curiosity, and I find that UNESCO, for instance, used this link in several articles. So let's say that the beginning of the link is from researchers, not from the media, most probably. We as a media people, we try to to put the most attractive phrase or the hook on the title. Maybe we do this, but the beginning of this link comes from researchers. And I know that the media bias is not covering all the other scenarios, the solutions, the cooperations. We only focus on water war, and this is the mistake. So from my point of view, I don't think that covering water war is the mistake in itself. It might be the over coverage, the excessive coverage of this water war thing. I don't know if Emmanuel will agree or not, but it's open to discussion. What else? Yeah, and this, and I remember that during, for instance, the Iraqi war, as a media people, we were covering the war, and we were using this image that come from Iraq too much, and it was very emotional. And then I read a study that mentioned that using this image too much at the beginning, it moves the feelings and the emotion of the audience, but the excessive use of those kind of image after a while stop affecting the audience. I mean, in other words, I mean, the use of this message, the message of water war, might be for the purpose of warning the audience from the consequences of not taking care of water and not cooperating. But good intentions. This message is not clear from the media, the international media. This is what I have in mind regarding to this topic.
Thanks, Rehab. And Joydeep?
I agree with Rehab in most respects. You see, the way when you talk about the water war framing by editors is essentially an exaggeration of a framing of water conflict between various governments in a transboundary situation. And the the reasons for the exaggeration may be, as I said earlier, to gather in a bigger audience. The reasons for the exaggeration may be to curry favor with certain governments and certain politicians, and to take a charitable view of it. The reasons for exaggeration may be, as Rehab said, to warn people away from moving that conflict further in the direction of war. So there I can see that there are lots of vested interests in that framing of a water conflict as a water war. So I see this all the time, this kind of framing. I do not take it as seriously as the so-called strat frat does. and I do not take it as seriously because the so-called StratFrat has a very jingoistic view of water. And water is one of those things where if you take a jingoistic view, you get it wrong, which is why we have so few water agreements between countries, because countries take a jingoistic view. The entire way in which water diplomacy has been conducted, at least well over 100 years now, is completely a case of putting the cart before the horse. You put diplomats or hydro engineers of two countries to talk about water in a transboundary river situation, and history tells us, experience tells us, that the absolute best you can hope for is a zero-sum game. Because the absolute best you can hope for is apportioning that water, breaking up that river. It's not something that takes the ecological importance of the river into account. It looks at the river from the very reductionist point of view of being a pipe of water and nothing more, whereas a river is a lot more than a water pipe. And this is what diplomats don't get. This is what most hydro engineers don't get. And that is why we get the kind of framing that we do.
Thanks so much, Joydeep. So Rehab suggested that that sometimes the media can focus on water conflicts to the exclusion of focusing on some other issues. Jennifer, what do you see some of the other common narratives that you see in reporting about water negotiations? What do you see there, and what can the impact be of some of these narratives?
Yeah, I think one narrative that I also see, and that is linked also certainly to this water war or water conflict narrative, and to one topic that was mentioned also here now all the time, this national security. So I think one narrative is this narrative of national interest. So this idea, there is one national interest, and these are common for one country, and they are basically opposite to each other. And that's certainly also a message diplomats or governments give in these international negotiations. But at the end, the national interest is also a construct and also the result of a negotiation process within the countries. Also within the countries, there are many different interests and stakeholders, and the power plays among them also determine what then is elevated to a national interest. And I think breaking up this idea of a national interest and showing also the differences within a country can on the one hand help to a better understanding also of the constraints that diplomats have, the limited space they might have in negotiation also within their own country, but also to see alliances across the country. So joint interests of, let's say, for example, environmental groups or certain sectors across the countries that actually have similar interests. So that you break up, these ideas that it's only country blocks that are opposite each other and that are one uniform block. So I think that's something, that we're actually media with, when focusing not only, I think Ashok mentioned in the beginning, that we focus on once the agreement is done and we have this high level shiny event, but actually there are so many negotiations and steps before, like smaller steps that I think can just lead to a better understanding of what's actually going on there in terms of cooperation between very different actors, and what are the many different interests are beyond this a government's representation.
And how much of a factor is gender in amongst all of these issues that are at play?
I think gender comes comes in when we think again about this diversity of interests of actors that are there. So if we focus only on the agreement that maybe is there at the end, or maybe even or the opposite, like a speech from a president, then usually we see men in suits, as it was called, I think, in one of the podcasts. So, you know, we see these formal diplomats, and which are very often men that shake hands or that draw speeches. But we forget, you know, that there are many, many people behind these processes, advisors, journalists that inform, experts that are there, NGOs that lobby, or business sectors that lobby. So, and they are certainly, women might be more visible and also active, even if they are not seen at the highest level. So I think to broaden the scope in reporting also means to be more diverse, to see who actually is playing a role in these processes. And then I think we come also to more gender diversity.
Thanks. And Emanuele and Ashok, from the sort of research perspective, how often do transboundary water bodies actually lead to cooperation between states? Emanuele, let's start with you.
Sorry, Fiona, transboundary water bodies or institutions? Or
bodies of water, rivers or international lakes, that sort of thing.
Okay, well, I think that also building on what was said by Rehab, by Ashok, and by Jennifer, here the issue is how to communicate the complexity of water and politics into media, into mainstream media, how to make this digestible, understandable for lay audiences. Because if we take the, I like what Ashok said, that water is never, wars are never one-dimensional, monodimensional. There's no, like, or migration. We often hear talking about climate change migrants, climate change refugees. Like, it's exactly like water wars. And that's why personally I don't like this idea, because it reduces the complexity and suggests some links. Okay, there's water scarcity and population growth, therefore there will be war, therefore there will be conflict. I like your suggestion then to look at the water bodies, because as Jennifer would say, often what we see acting on the stage of the media debate are the state. Is Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt. They act as the main character of the play. They feel emotions, they take actions, and in the way also the media, the story is constructed, but they're not living entities, while instead the body, the river, is a living entity. So perhaps instead of talking about water wars, we should talk about wars on water, against water, and think about all the pollution, all the non-sustainable uses that are made of this river. And therefore, and as Jennifer suggested, here we can see also transboundary alliances, fishermen, small farmers, or journalists from different countries, researchers from different countries, might find a common interest, something they're shared about in their relation to waters and to the river. And that's the message we will be trying to convey also with photojournalists from different Nile Basin countries. Then in the next weeks and month, we'll work around this hashtag Everyday Nile, try exactly to bring back people and people relations to the river on the stage of public information and public debate by sharing everyday actions and emotions on water and rivers.
Thanks. And Ashok, how often do we actually see the formal or informal water sharing agreements between states? Is that something that's common?
I think we must go back to the history. History has been the that we see that the cooperation or the working together on water has been the source of civilization, source of country building, source of nation building forever. So there has been, I mean, the world has experienced the history of cooperation over water for millennia. That's not the point. The point thing, and we do see, of course, there have been some agreements have been signed in recent years in the transboundary rivers, but there are many rivers that are informal cooperation works, which I remember even the Amundaria Sirdaria River, the in the Central Asia when there were no agreements. These officials, those who had a quite good, strong social capital from the Soviet era, they could call each other, phone each other, and get the things going. So even the politicians were not agreeing for an agreement. So there are a number of informal agreement which works, and that's why the situation, so the system has been developing. But as you know, there are certain issues which are possibly to highlight it for political reasons. That because if you politicize the water, you securitize the water, it helps for certain political actors to gain politically. And that's really creates a problem that how you depoliticize these waters from when the negotiation takes place, because it's extremely important to depoliticize, desecuritize the water if the negotiator will able to reach a negotiated settlement. And that's where the politicians of the political parties usually make a mistake. When they really, for political reasons, they try to create a conflict of their own, which is not supposed to be. When the people get engaged, now because of the social media, all sorts of people are making points, it becomes very difficult when you come to the negotiating table. And as Jennifer was saying, this is mostly the negotiating table are manned by particularly these guys, those who have very little understanding of the water, male in suits, so they don't really understand the gender parts or the ecological part, completely out of the into their own strategic sphere or political sphere of thinking. But at the same time, whenever we have seen the agreements have been signed, always these water agreements has become so securitized. It's only the top leaders have to agree, then the meeting gets signed. We usually may organize a number of events where we invite the environment ministers and water ministers. They come, they say nice things, and we think, oh, probably it's going to work. But when they go back, they don't really in the power configuration in their countries. They don't really belong in the top. And this is where we need to engage the top guy in the country. Without the top persons, because water is such an important issue. So how to engage these guys into this, that they do depoliticize the water, try to gain, because you have to also tell them how you can gain, how you can really, and there the media has a huge role. But in the case, the media has to be free, independent, and also given that kind of possibility by the political leadership to create a scenario or create a situation or create an image or bring back to that what exactly the possibility of what this cooperation will bring, rather than creating securitization. I think these are the issues, and I think this is the problem. It's not a new problem. The problem is quite long term. And I think only we are unable to understand it. We are only getting very excited when the one or two countries sign in the agreement. We don't realize that there is a larger number of, like, if there is an agreement between India and China over Brahmaputra, do you think it will ever solve the problem? No. There are other countries in the basin. Similarly, even if now we are looking for an agreement between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, if these three countries, I mean, that will be quite big. But I think this will be also, we need other countries also in the long run to come into the agreement. So there is always, we need to really look at what sort of cooperation, who is cooperating, where they are cooperating, and why they are cooperating. And I think that's where we have to really look at it much more broadly and much more comprehensively while we are analyzing this cooperation, non-cooperation, or we are framing it as a water war, or water conflict way.
Thanks, Ashok. Lots of really important points there. You mentioned social media. Joydeep and Rehab, I wonder if I can just get your reflections on how social media has perhaps impacted on the way that you report on water. Has conversations that happen on social media or reactions on social media, has that in any way changed the dynamics of water reporting sort of across media in your regions, or just for yourselves and amongst your networks? Joydeep, perhaps let's begin with you.
Okay. Social media has played a role in this particular kind of reportage and the way it has influenced this kind of reportage. Unfortunately, it has not played a constructive role. It's played a very negative role because for the same reason that social media has played negative roles in anti-democratic movements, whether it be in the US or whether it be in Turkey or in various other parts of the world, including India nowadays. Because what social media has done is to make people talk more and more within their own echo chambers. And therefore, whenever they find anything that tries to bring some fresh air into those echo chambers, they react, let's say, violently, because there is a lot of, at least verbal violence. There is an enormous amount of trolling in this. So, of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but by and large, I would have to say that social media's role in sensible water reportage has been negative.
Okay, thank you. And Rehab?
Well, I will not add a lot to what what has been mentioned, but yes, the social media, of course, has a role, a big role, and a negative one regarding to the Nile issue. And during the last weeks, I spotted a lot of rumors and lies spread in social media, and especially during the last weeks because of what's going on between Sudan and Ethiopia. So and how Egypt is somehow not involved, but involved like in a critical situation. So yes, social media has a big role on spreading information, but I think it's a kind of justified role because of the lack of information on the real media, or the media platforms. So because media platforms are depending on press releases and not doing this analytical and criticism kind of article, not giving enough information to the audience. So those audience are trying to find any kind of source to get those informations, and this is how they go for. They use social media as one of the sources, or might be main source. I tried to like follow some of those big big pages on Facebook or YouTube channels that offer information on the dam and the Nile, and I tried to fact check most of those information, and honestly, almost 90% of them were totally wrong informations. So, and on the other hand, those pages have a lot of followers, so we can have an image about the effect that those pages are making on the audience. yeah, unfortunately, social media has a big role.
Thanks, Rehab. We'll move the discussion towards some solutions and some ways to support reporting on water conflict and water cooperation. We've had a couple of questions from the audience. We've got Fabian in Burundi. He says, how really can media fruitfully influence negotiations or engagement? We have in the Nile Basin water conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, and this affects all Nile country members. What can media in the Nile region do so as to influence negotiations and then ultimately lead to an agreement? And then we also have a question from Jyotiraj. I'm not sure where you are, so I think your question is directed towards Ashok, but I think it can really go towards the whole panel. From your experience, why do science and research often get marginalized in political discourse on shared waters, and what could be potential measures to improve more evidence-informed media discourse? So let's open this up now to discussion. What can be done to strengthen reporting as it relates to water diplomacy, and why is this important that this happens? Jennifer, perhaps let's begin with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when I prepared for this this panel debate, I tried to remember. I worked also as a diplomat for many years, and also for regional security organizations. So we really worked on water issues in very sensitive settings. And I tried to remember. So how did we relate with journalists and media? And I think just one point I'd like to add here, because very often, and it was also mentioned here, this idea that, you know, there is mistrust or there is caution towards media because, you know, there might be misquotations or misrepresentation. But I think what is also important that certainly diplomats also are users of media. I mean, the embassies read the media in the country and report back to the capital. And as a good diplomat, you know, who is covering a country, would also meet with journalists to get a better feeling of the country and a better idea of the mood in a country, and understand the country better beyond, you know, what he gets or she gets in official talks. So I think here, I mean, and that's maybe more an indirect role of media, because the first audience of media is the general public, but also to be aware that when there are trustful relations between officials and media, and, you know, when the reporting is correct, and also diplomats feel, okay, you know, this is a serious person who also understands the topic, then indeed there can be also this other way of media impacting negotiations and actually informing also political actors. While that's different or difficult to measure also. And yeah, and regarding this question about this more evidence, and yeah, I think, I mean, it's a difficult question, because I mean, we are researchers and scientists, and I mean, our science works based on evidence. So this is the logic of our system, but it's not the logic of politics. So politics is about different interests and about you know, one position and opposition, and the bargaining or negotiation process. So I think it's always challenging to get evidence in, and it's also and I think we also have to see that it's also legitimate to have political interest. So politics is nothing bad as such. So, but it's just a little bit a different logic. And I think that it's not only on media, it's not only the responsibility for media to bring, you know, more evidence-based information, but also on researchers. So I think, Rehab, at one point you made this point, you know, that also media takes up what is there in science. So I think this science communication and also for scientists to think about, okay, how can we maybe inform policymakers, or how can we translate our results in a way that they are also accessible to a wider audience beyond our circle of peers, that might also an important task to address.
Thanks, Jennifer. Joydeep?
Yeah, I think I more or less agree with what Jennifer has said. And yes, there are ways in which the media can definitely help in water cooperation, including, as Jennifer pointed out, a sort of, I won't say education, but making diplomats more aware of the situation on the ground. At a more fundamental level, it is well understood, I think, by everybody looking at transboundary water issues, that at the end of the day, any agreement is between one sovereign country and another. But as I said earlier, you start that process by putting the diplomats and the hydrocrats of these countries together, and you're not going to get anywhere that is constructive. But there is a much more constructive way of starting this process. And that way is to put the residents of those river basins together across boundaries. That way is to put researchers and academics across boundaries together. That way is to put journalists across the boundaries together. It actually works. We have a lot of evidence in Brahmaputra and other parts of the world that I could quote for you. And basically when people-to-people cooperation works, when researcher-to-researcher cooperation works, when journalist-to-journalist story idea exchange works, then there is a groundswell that moves it further up towards governments and actually gives well-meaning governments a sort of platform on which to build water cooperation. To me, that's the way to go. If you want to actually build water cooperation between countries in transboundary river basins, that is what I meant by saying that if you put diplomats first, you're putting the cart before the horse. To me, the horse is having that groundswell built up through people-to-people contacts, through researcher-to-researcher contacts, etc. I'll give you one very simple example. In China and India actually have, in the Brahmaputra, an information sharing agreement on water flows. And the genesis of that agreement was a flash flood that started due to a landslide in China. And when the flash flood came, overwhelming that landslide, it killed an estimated 1,000 people downstream in India. And then when this was at a time when there was absolutely nothing happening between the governments in terms of talking. But the researchers were talking. Both Indian and Chinese researchers and academics were talking. And when Indian researchers asked their Chinese colleagues, why didn't you tell us? The Chinese colleagues told the Indian researchers, yes, we had seen this landslide and we wanted to warn you people, but we had no means to do so. There was no channel of communication open at that time. And that was conveyed to both the governments by the scientists. And that was how the first information sharing agreement was reached between the countries. So this is at a slightly larger level. There are other very good examples at more local levels, including one right now on the Brahmaputra basin of early flood alert systems being sent by people in Bhutan to people in India through WhatsApp groups. So they don't bother about going through the government. By that time, the flood would have come and gone. So they're in the same WhatsApp group. So the villagers upstream Just send a WhatsApp to the villagers downstream in India saying, hey, listen, the water level is rising. You guys better move. So there are ways of doing this. And it's important for the media to highlight this. And that may well be the way forward.
Thanks. That's a really lovely thought about the villagers sharing information amongst themselves. Jane, how can media reporting on water be strengthened within the Nile Basin region?
Thank you. Let me start from what Joydeep has just said, the idea of people to people. And this is what we are looking at in NBI when it comes to the media, bringing the journalists from the 10 Nile Basin NBI member states together, and to the extent that we also encourage them to report from maybe on one piece, from a transboundary perspective, reporting on the same story, coming together, journalists from maybe 2 or 3 different countries, and then working together on a piece of story and writing it together. And we are also having our Nile Media Awards. And so this is one of the things that we are looking at, a special prize for the winning story that has been written together, whereby journalists have collaborated on putting that story together. So I really believe that this kind of arrangement is very important in as far as water diplomacy is concerned, bringing different people together. So what can be done to help the journalists to report better? It's through training, for example. At the NBI, we do training for journalists as one of the ways to help them to break down those complex issues so that they can be able to report from an informed point of view, and also to be able to ask some relevant questions, because now they know, at least they have an idea of the subject. Rehab mentioned earlier that some journalists just get a press release and use that. I think one of the reasons they just use the press release is they do not understand the issues. So they just pick the press release and run away with it, and then just use that to report. So they are not able to ask more questions after receiving that kind of press release. And this is what we are trying to address at the NBI, to train them in those in those technical issues, so that they can understand and be able to ask questions from an informed point of view to get more information. Thank you.
And how do you identify journalists and how do you bring them together? Do you meet physically or does it tend to be a virtual meeting?
Well, in the past, it has been physically. We bring them together in a room. And the way we identify them, we do work with the media houses. First of all, we have what are the key media houses in all the different countries, for example. We've done some kind of media analysis. And so we work together we contact through maybe the editors, but also through what the journalists are reporting, which journalist reports on what and how often. And then we can identify such a person and reach out to them so that they can be part of the team of journalists that we are engaging, so that we can have a number of journalists understanding these issues over time, all the issues related to the Nile Basin, Nile Cooperation, so for them to understand them over time. So we keep on engaging them, and with the hope that we are able to get them on board, to appreciate the issues, to understand them, and therefore report from an informed. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Emanuele, I think there's a few training and cooperative sorts of initiatives going on that you're involved with.
Yes, and I've been very happy of being involved in such all these trainings and activities, because also indeed what I've learned, as was also mentioned by Jennifer, that sometimes we tend to focus on the differences and the frictions between journalists and researchers. But indeed, by working with journalists, I also discovered that there are many things that journalists and researchers, scientists have in common, and they're both groups, categories, try to represent reality, to give a description, a representation of the reality, which is as most accurate as possible. Of course, I'm talking about good journalists and good researchers, but that's what we aim to work with and to be, I think. So I would also like to comment on and share two ideas that we learn on how media can help and facilitate water negotiation and cooperation. So the first one, so I agree with Jennifer that journalists themselves should think about themselves as water diplomats, and because they have a great power in terms of how they frame their stories. And I will make two examples also to answer the two questions from the audience. So the first one is about how do we frame the water controversy? In the question, it was Egypt against Ethiopia. And we found in our research that often when it comes to the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam or the Nile, it was simply framed as a conflict, as a bilateral issue between Ethiopia and Egypt. And when you frame it as a bilateral issue, immediately there was a rising in the tension because it was considered a zero-sum game, one lose and the other one. But as soon as Sudan was brought in the picture, which lies in the middle of the two countries, so there was a more, so the fact that from bilateral, it became multilateral, trilateral, opened up spaces for thinking differently about the conflict and bringing in different solutions. So the second example is, or reflection is, how to talk to scientists, how to report on technical and scientific facts, which are key, as it was said in water diplomacy dispute. And as Jennifer said, science works on evidence, but I think science also works on debate. Science is a debate by its very nature. So in different disciplines might see the same problems from different perspectives and might also have different solutions to it. So as a journalist, I think it's important to reflect on such variety and some complexity, and reflect such complexity and variety in the way we tell stories about international rivers. So for instance, instead of interviewing an expert from Sudan, an expert from Egypt, and an expert from Ethiopia to tell again the national interest story, why not interviewing an engineer, and then an anthropologist, and then a natural scientist that will bring different perspectives on the same dam or on the same river. So I think the issue is how to reflect the complexity and the variety in a report which is accessible to the to wider audiences. Of course, it's not an easy task, but I think it's badly needed, and that's why we are here. That's why we've been publishing the handbook, and that's why also tomorrow we will kick off an online course for scientists and researchers, because they also have to learn how to better communicate their work. And yeah, that's why I think we are all here to because we want to do this better.
And we'll drop a link to the course into the chat just at the end. We've just got about 10 minutes left. Rehab, we have a reporter from Uganda, Sarah Natolo, who has just commented that she believes that more trainings on water conflict issues can bring a positive change. Do you share this view? And do you view yourself as a water diplomat?
Do I share this view? Yes, definitely yes. I in a personal level, I see how trainings made a huge difference in the way I report water and in the way I understand water. Let's give an example. Understanding small and fine details that makes a difference in the way I understand the concepts of water. It makes me less subjected to misleading the readers or asking the right question to the researcher. For instance, I recently came to understand the very small thing, but it makes a difference. The difference between physical scarcity and economic scarcity, and how when mentioning scarcity, we should understand the difference between not having enough amount of water and not having a good infrastructure because of some failing economic or political system within the country. So yeah, training makes a big difference. One of the very positive things about trainings is the networking that you made during those trainings, whether by getting to know journalists from other countries, which help, again, what Jennifer said, team working and working together to make a better, to bring all the voices and make a more concrete article on the water. And the other thing is networking with experts, which have been done repeatedly during trainings at IHD Delft or CIWI or NBI. So yes, training makes a lot of differences in different scales regarding journalists. And the other question, can you remind me what was it?
Whether you see yourself as a water diplomat, as Manuela suggested.
I will do this from now on. I didn't consider it, but I was always thinking of myself as a bridge between researchers and audience and everyone. And I was the person. I see myself as the person who's seeing the big picture, which is normally scientists see part of it and policy makers see part of it. But for me, because I'm talking to everyone, I see all the parts of this picture. This is how I see myself. But being diplomat is a great is another position that I would love to play. Yeah.
Thanks, Rehab. And finally, Ashok, what do you think can be done to support reporting on water negotiations and water issues?
I think this is the water negotiation. It has been mentioned that it has been dominated by the people, those who don't understand it. The diplomats really have no clue what is on the water issue. They usually look at it and again, state versus state issue, like they use, any other issue. And the water is a complicated, complex issue, like also climate change. And unfortunately, most of the countries in the South do not have people to have specifically diplomatic staffs that you can really understand the water. So I think it's very important. We need to understand that the countries that you cannot afford to have those kind of multi-level structure of the diplomats in their place who can negotiate different things. So I think it is somehow needs to some sort of training of the diplomats also necessary in those countries who can understand that there are water issues because it's complex, because it's complicated, we cannot push it to the top, have the file down, or we can keep this file for some time, not to think about it. So I think these are the kind of things which needs to be also looked at, besides the understanding, the common understanding of the political party, because I think the political actors are extremely important. They are the ones who, because the water is such a sensitive and a very highly politicized issue, they usually have to be also educated to somehow. But I think in this case, the role of media is absolutely important. Who will do that? It's the media. Unfortunately, Joydeep has told so many things about the social media. I completely agree. But the social media is also influencing our media. The media, which used to be somehow some kind of responsible reporting, trying to check things before, that is not happening anymore. They are trying to compete with social media, coming out of the informations, messages, and also most of the time dependent on social media for the informations and the news. And I think that is creating problem. It is important that the media takes these roles quite seriously, and this is somehow dependent on how the whole media structure, whether the media is independent, whether media can have that kind of voices in countries, whether the media are actually playing for the being as a media or being as the mouthpiece of the government or a particular political party or a particular business houses. And I think these are kind of all these issues we need to really look at. And different countries do have the different compulsions. We completely understand that. But I think it is also very important. The media training has to be done. Media training is very, very important. And I think whom to train, that's also significant. I remember in the 97, I think I was engaged in the media training of the young environmental journalists in South Asia, particularly in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan basin. And now they are kind of, in a much more position that they can really engage in managing the editorial decisions in different type of journals or newspapers how the reporting should be. So I think we need to have both sides, but when we really try to convince the media or try to look at the media, how to report and how to do this kind of sensible, sensitive way of reporting and responsible way to create different stages of a different, whom to train or whom to really pass on the message. So I think also need to remember that it's a good training of the younger media professionals can be a very long-term investment where we need to look at it. And these water issues are not going anywhere. These water issues are getting much more complicated because of changing power relationship, changing climate, and with other kinds of issues. So I think the international community, the whole, anyone who are interested really in this, the bridging the gap between research, science, and media, they need to really think carefully that there is a comprehensive policy needed, how to bring this more into a motion that where everybody can get benefited. And the water cooperation is extremely important for all sorts of security and to bring peace, sustainable peace in the world.
Thanks, Ashok, for rounding us out there. For me, I think the topic that was brought up of the importance of free and independent media, that really resonates for me, working within media. So thanks again for joining us. It was a really rich discussion. We could have talked for a long time, but unfortunately we are at the end of our time. So as Emanuele just mentioned, tomorrow IHE Delft and SciDev-Net are launching a new open online course, which is called Science Communication for Water Cooperation and Diplomacy. My colleague Davis will share the link in the chat box there. He shared some links to the handbook. I can see all the links are in there. Davis, I saw that somebody mentioned that they were disconnected and would appreciate if you could just copy those links back in there again. And so the aim of the course is to enable participants to develop practical skills to confidently engage with the media and to effectively communicate research and professional work. So do sign up today if you'd like to take part in that. That will begin tomorrow. There's also a link in there to our 3-part podcast series on water conflict and cooperation, which we just released over the previous 6 or 7 weeks. That was created with the support of IHE Delft and the DU PC2 project. So you can check out the link there. That will take you to all 3 episodes. And finally, the recording of this debate will be available shortly on SciDev-Net within the next couple of days. So if there's anything that you want to check again, or if you'd like to share the link with any colleagues or anybody who couldn't make it, that will be available there. So thanks again to panelists for taking the time. It was a fantastic conversation. And thank you to everybody in the audience. And take care out there.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for
Bye.
Bye-bye.